Okay, I think the show has been stolen, don't you?
Of course, that's what usually happens.
Well, thank you for that wonderful, stirring talk and for coming to Gainesville. And we always love having you here, of course. And look at this turnout. They had to open up the upstairs, and we were not expecting that. So there will be a microphone upstairs, and as I said earlier, a microphone in each aisle down below here. And I will, as people line up to ask questions, I will start off with something of a softball question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. You and I are former colleagues here. We were in the history department together, and on occasion we'd go out for lunch, and we talk about a lot of things, but inevitably our conversations would turn to writing, something that you and I both love to do. And you are very passionate about your subject. You are also passionate as a writer. Your writing is scholarly, but it's readable. You dig into serious problems, you dissect them, you deconstruct them, and then you're able to share them with your audience in a way that they can understand. Your writing is graceful, it's eloquent. You're a master storyteller, as you did today. You organize your subject around storytelling. So why and how did you come to be such a writer? And how did you learn to write? Excuse me. What writers have inspired you, either politically or just aesthetically?
So, man, my parents, I grew up watching them write sermons and deliver sermons. My father is a poet. I went to journalism school as an undergraduate, and then when I became a scholar, I decided that I didn't want just other scholars reading my work. I wanted to figure out a way for the work to be deeply scholarly, but simultaneously accessible to everyday people. And so probably the scholar who inspired me the most to write and deliver in that way is W.B. Du Bois. W.B. Du Bois. And so he, of course, and I think with that as well is he also had the courage to use at times his own personal story as a window to larger scholarly or societal sort of questions. And obviously, as you know, we're not necessarily trained or even instructed to use personal narrative. And so when I was struggling with how to be an anti-racist and whether to even use personal narrative, and part of me did not want to do it because I was concerned about how my colleagues in the academy would respond. You know, I remembered The Souls of Black Folk, to give an example, which was Du Bois's most famous book. And in most of that book, he uses his personal story to, again, elucidate larger points about race in America. And he also he wrote scholarly texts, but then he also wrote for The Atlantic, which I write for now. And so, and for me, especially at this time, when there's such an assault on truth and knowledge, and we have people, scholars, who are employed to seek out and to produce truth and knowledge. If we are not leading the conversation on the most pressing issues of our day, then who else is going to do it? But the only way we can lead those conversations is if we make our work accessible.
Why don't we start over here? You have the longer line.
Welcome back to Gainesville. Hi, Imani. We have in Gainesville, a school system that has just finally started doing Black history at every high school after decades of begging, but there's gaps in the historic narrative you could sail the Moorish Navy through. We have elected officials in city and county government who touted anti-racist policies all over the place when they were running and won't whisper them from the dais. They offer community development to Black neighborhoods, but it's really gentrification. So my question is a fake anti-racist the same as a racist or worse?
I guess she wants me to answer that too. So to me, one of the things that I try to do with how to be an anti-racist is to simplify it, that you basically have anti-racist and racist. And so there's really no such thing as a fake anti-racist or even a fake racist. And I think because I anchored the book in definitions, one of the things that I wanted people to do is use those definitions and first and foremost to apply them to themselves, and then of course to apply them to other people. And so I think it's actually probably better for people who know more about these people, but can use those definitions to really answer those questions.
Why don't we, over here, to my left, please.
Hi, my name is Ebony Love, and I'm a second-year law student at the University of Florida Levin College of Law. First, I have to say thank you because you're helping me write my seminar paper, which is talking about basically Amendment 4 and Senate Bill 7066, which is limiting the amount of former felons who are allowed to register to vote in the state of Florida. So my question is, in the legal field, it's really hard for us to acknowledge what racist roots we have in the legal field overall. And you talked about acceptance in your speech today. So how can we get to a point where we in the legal field can accept our racist roots in order to address them and make overall comprehensive change for the better?
So I think that I think that in the 1960s, during the civil rights, and certainly during the sort of Black Power movements, there was a tremendous debate as to how we should define a policy as racist. And by the 1970s, legally, those who wanted to define a racist policy based on its intent and based on having racial language in the policy largely won that legal debate. And so as a result, it's difficult in our time to recognize the roots of racist policies and the history of racist policies, let alone the present, because most people are still using the definition of basically a policy is racist if we can find an email stating that the policymaker intended to exclude a particular racial group. And short of finding that email or that, quote, evidence, the policy is not racist, especially when the person denies that it's racist, just like our president says what? No quid pro quo. So suddenly, what you're supposed to believe, I didn't mean to go there, but I mean, just the hearings of just, playing back in my mind. And so I think what has to happen is we have to re-engage that argument within the legal field. And obviously it's hard to re-engage it when you have judges who largely shape legal discourse and they're seeking in every which way to reinforce that. But so this is, in a way, not only a legal fight, it's a political fight. And, from judges to, of course, legal doctrine. And we just have to recognize the sort of nature of that fight in order to win it.
Way up in the clouds,
Yes.
In the blue shirts, up above.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. So my question is, there has been acts of horror in terms of racism at your college, American University, which I'm alumni, in terms of the former student body president, where they were hanging bananas. There's now incidents in Syracuse University of racism that was reported by the New York Times. At what point do these acts, in your mind, reach the level that we consider them violent acts? And what is your position going into the 2020 election in terms of the expected violence that's going to happen? And what do you think is the appropriate response to that violence?
So, I mean, I think that you can have there are statements, there are words that people can say that deeply hurt people in the way a punch can hurt people. And so I think that, but I also think it's critical for us to distinguish between words or between hanging of nooses or bananas and someone, you know, coming onto a campus with an AR-15. I think it's a very different scenario. But more so to your second sort of question, and you know, I'm not going to have to necessarily experience this as much in DC, but you're certainly going to have to experience this in Florida. And that is that the strategy, the re-election strategy is very simple. It's to suppress as many votes as possible and to basically make as many of his supporters believe that white Americans are under attack and he is their savior. And the way he's going to do that is through viciously racist ideas. And so that's then going to result in what has essentially been happening for years now. It's going to lead to violence. And you know, I'm really fearful. Fearful probably isn't the best word, but it's going to be a dangerous time in America in 2020. Just as, you know, Jack and I can talk about how dangerous it was in 1876, when there was a similar battle for the future, the racial future of this country. And I just want each of you, just like I want Americans more broadly, to realize when they're being had, when they're being took, and when they're being manipulated.
Over here.
Hi, my name is Deborah Hepburn. I'm the manager for pastoral services and spiritual care at UF Health. Ibram, let's talk about the church. I think you have some insights about the church that others may or may not have. My concern is, I lived in Pennsylvania for many years, for 30 years, and I came here after 30 years to help a church. When I was in Pennsylvania, I worked in a large white Anglo rich church as a pastor. And then I came here to my denomination where I grew up. When I was in Pennsylvania, I worked on anti-racist programs, installing them in the life of the church, marching when we needed to, and having the voice of justice, speaking against injustices in my community. I come to Gainesville, and I joined my church where I grew up. And I am silenced at this point. And the reason I've been silenced is because I called my church out on incorporating white racist dogma into the canon of law within my denomination. And I was called down from my ministry because of it. So my question to you is, how do you serve an injunction today? Not necessarily a negative, but a positive, or an insight to the Black church, how we can maintain our authentic voice of justice without having to compromise and accept doctrines that are not authentically ours.
Sure. So, so my parents, and they're here. And this is in the book, so they're okay with this. My parents met in right about this time in 1970. And they were two students who went to this major conference of 10,000 Christian evangelical students in Urbana, Illinois. It was called Urbana 70. And there was about 500 Black students who came, along with most of the students being white. And those Black students were able to, on the second night of the week-long conference after Christmas in 1970, allocate one day for Black theology. And so back then, my parents' froze were quite high, as there were other sort of Black folks in the Black Power movement. And they welcomed this Black evangelical preacher named Tom Skinner, who gave this electrifying speech. And his basic message in that speech was that Jesus was a revolutionary, and that the job of the Christian is to be like Jesus. And so therefore, the job of the Christian is to be a what? Revolutionary. And that the job of the church is to be the citadel for revolutionaries. That the job of the church is to liberate society from the shackles of oppression. And it deeply contrasted with the type of theology that they had been taught, and that was predominant in many Black churches, let alone in white churches. And this was more of a civilizer theology. That the job of the church is to civilize these behaviorally backward people, to save them from their own inferior, backward, behaviorally deficient ways. And so, after hearing Skinner's speech, they, of course, sort of, as I write in the book, joined the sort of churchless church of the Black Power movement, and their froze got a little higher. But ultimately, they adopted liberation theology. And I think Black churches, like white churches, need to decide what type of theology they are going to preach. Is it going to be a theology of liberation, or is it going to be a theology of trying to civilize people? And just know that civilizer theology breeds racist theology. And because what it does for Black people, it says, you know what's wrong with Black people? They're behaviorally deficient. And the job of the church is to bring these behaviorally deficient people in and civilize them. And then once they start working harder, they'll be less likely to be unemployed. Once they start being so violent, they won't be more likely to commit crimes, because there's no racism. The problem is these behavioral deficiencies. And so we have Black churches preaching this and teaching this, just as we have white churches preaching this and teaching this. And can I just say one more thing about this? What's ironic is let's say if you are a powerful political or even economic figure, and as a result of your policies, people are struggling. And are you gonna support a church that is teaching civilizer theology, that people are struggling because of what they're not doing? Or are you going to support a church that's preaching liberation theology? So then we can begin to understand the relationship between these mega churches and these mega powerful political and economic figures. That I want people to struggle as a minister, because the more they struggle, particularly economically, the more they're going to feel they need me.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is LaToya Scott, and I'm currently a PhD student at UF studying intersectionality of race and gender. I also hail from the Seven Hills, PMU, I had a question pertaining to your definitions. So coming into this book, I had already read White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, which I saw she put an endorsement for your work. What I kind of had a question towards was, something that made me, while I was reading it, not uncomfortable, but it made me think, which is a great thing. By your definition, it kind of seems that anybody could be a racist. But by Angelo's definition, she's saying that people where the policies are not in our favor to make certain prejudices into laws, you cannot be a racist. And that's coming from the positionality of a white woman who studies whiteness studies. How do you kind of contend with these definitions and the positionality from that point?
Yeah. So very quickly, I think we're arguing, particularly those of us who are studying racism and trying to define it, we're actually arguing two different things simultaneously without necessarily knowing it. And so I actually agree with the position that historically Black people as a collective have not benefited from racism, and as a collective have actually been anti-racist. When you look at who has led and who has predominated in anti-racism struggles historically. But then when we talk about a different question, which is, can an individual Black person be racist? And have historically individual Black people, have they been racist? That's a completely different discussion. And I would argue that there are individual Black people in this society who have power. Well, let me first say that every single Black individual has power. And you know what that power is? The power to resist. And I think we should never forget that we have that power to resist. And historically, individual Black people have used that power to resist, and other individual Black people have not. And then how do we distinguish between those who say, why are you challenging police brutality? You're the one who continues to harass those police. You're the reason why Black people are disproportionately likely to be killed by police, versus the person who's actually challenging. Like, there's a complete distinction in terms of how they're conceiving of the problem and what they conceive of the solution. But then also I wanna, you mentioned how you studied intersectionality. And one of the things that I've realized through studying racism is that we historically have thought about the perpetrator when we're defining the term racist, and even the term racist policy, as opposed to the victim. What that means is, if, for instance, a series of Black girls are preyed upon sexually by a person, and that person specifically targeted Black girls, not girls of many different races, but Black girls, we are going to respond differently than if that person is white, than if that person is R. Kelly. And for me, they're doing the same thing. But if we're thinking about it from the perspective of the perpetrator, as opposed to the victims, then it doesn't matter who the person is. If you are targeting a particular racial group, and Black women are a racial group, then you're being racist. And what that does is that frees us up to do what we should have always been doing when we're thinking about racism, is fundamentally focus on the outcomes and the victims.
Upstairs.
Hi, my name is Hayden Fletcher. Do you have a specific story that, like, a person is being racist to you?
So How to Be an Anti-Racist is actually filled with those stories. And to give an example of one story, I remember that I share in How to Be an Anti-Racist. I remember when I was a senior at Florida A&M University, and I wrote an article that was very critical of white people in the Tallahassee Democrat, and I sort of chronicle some of the things that I said. But I was at this time, I should say, the article was in the FAMU student newspaper. I was also at the time interning, I should say, at the Tallahassee Democrat. People in the community, particularly white people, saw that my bylines were in both papers. And they started calling up the Tallahassee Democrat and were like, how dare you have this person writing for you? So the editor of the Tallahassee Democrat called me into his office and started basically challenging me on some of the things that I was saying in this piece. And we went back and forth. And then eventually he decided that I wasn't backing down on some of the points that I was making and decided to switch gears. This editor was Black. He sort of took a deep breath, looked at me and said, you know, I hate it when I get pulled over and I'm treated like I'm one of them N-word. And in my mind, I was like, so you're distinguishing yourself? So you consider yourself to not be, and they are? In other words, they're the problem, and they have made it such that you're getting pulled over and mistreated, as opposed to the problem is that Black people are being mistreated? And in that moment, the reason why it was a very critical moment for me is because up until that point, I was actually doing the same thing. I was thinking of myself as this extraordinary Negro, that I was not like those ordinary inferior Black people. And I hated that white society was treating me like I was one. And what he said put up a mirror to my own ideas. And I had to confront it and I had to change.
We have time for one or two more. And over here to my right.
Yes, Dr. Kendi, I've read both of your books, and I'm really always eager for a good analytical discussion, analysis of things. But I find that there's a lot of confirmation bias in what you write, because you were raised with these philosophies, and maybe you've gone one step further, but I think it's sorely lacking in universities these days to have a good, open, honest adult conversation with different viewpoints. And I think that it's telling that when anybody to the right or the conservative side of things comes to campus, there's a list my arm long about what you can't bring in, and searches and signs and even purses. But yet it's different. When the left speaks, there's no threats. And that's telling, I think, about our society these days, about political correctness, and certain things are taboo. But I want to ask, are you a student of Dr. Joe Fagan?
No.
And also, are you a Marxist? Because basically, equity is the basis of Marxism, that we all end up on the same playing field regardless of...
So I'd like to encourage you to read my book.
I have.
And if you would have read my book, you would have seen that I was actually deeply critical of people on the left. Really, the entire book is critical of people on the left, but not only people on the left, it's actually critical of the ideas that I was raised with. You started out stating that I had confirmation sort of bias, and I more or less sort of configured the ways in which I was raised. Actually, the book is a deep analysis of how I was raised, and it's a deep critical analysis of how I was raised. And so, I think if you read the book again, you'll realize that.
Well,
we need to move over here. Thank you. Yes, we're, time for a quick question.
Hi, my name is Macy Geiger, and I'm a teacher here in Gainesville. And I've been reflecting on my own process and being a white person, and I grew up in denial because I grew up in a basically total white neighborhood. White schools had white teachers, and they taught me to be colorblind. It wasn't until I actually became an adult and started learning, and I know that that's also due to my privilege, that I really began to understand what racism really is and how systemic it is. And I like how you use the metaphor of how it's like a cancer. And so, of course, as a teacher now, I feel a huge responsibility to do this work and to teaching my students how to be anti-racist. But then I feel that the harder work that I'm encountering now is how to work with, especially it's my white colleagues who are still in that stage of denial. So what would be the steps that I can take? Like, where can we begin?
So I think one of the things that allows people to deny their racist ideas, for instance, is they don't have to define what a racist idea is. And so I think what I try to do with open-minded people who are in denial, and let's distinguish that from closed-minded people. But open-minded people, like, you can have a conversation with them, and through having those conversations, I think it's critical for them to define in a rigid and clear way what a racist idea is, to give an example, or racist policy is. And then once we have that clear definition that we then can apply to ourselves and our society, then of course we can begin unpacking our own ideas. And so, I think having those conversations about definitions is that best first step.
Yes, thank you. So, Dr. Kendi will move out to the lobby to sign books. Please do not stop him en route to ask a question, or he'll never get there. So thank you so much for coming. Linger in the lobby as long as you like. Nice job, man.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. I guess we should take